Well, it's good to see all of you out today. This is a wonderful day. I think that we got 1 inch of rain out there at our place. I'm glad to see some rain. We can use that. We're studying the book of Hebrews, so you'll have to peek in there, I'm sure, in a moment. We have barely got started. Last week we talked about some introductory matters. We'll hop into that right away quick. But let's invoke the Lord in prayer right now and we'll get started. Oh, great God of heaven, we're so thankful that you have been attending to needs of people, creatures of your hand from the very beginning. In fact, had plans for us before the foundation of the world. Thank you, Father, for your word, for the convicting power it has. We're thankful, Father, for the folks who come out today, and pray all who study will be blessed. In Jesus' name, amen. If you see somebody up here looking up, it's because they're trying to find somebody in the roost, I call it, up there, get the attention of the individual. Yes, Mark, if you want to bring up that visual we had last time, we'll get moving here. These are things that we need to have in our heads when we study from the book of Hebrew, some of the things from the Old Testament that are important for us to know in order to understand the reasoning of this author. Now, this person who wrote the book of Hebrews was one potent speaker. His arguments are tight, and if I was a person not convinced and not converted who came from the Hebrew faith, I would hate to take on this guy because he had so many proofs that he is enumerated in this book, and he even complains in the writing of the letter something along the lines that he has written these things in a few words, 13 chapters, and he's just getting wound up. So this man knew the Old Testament. All right, that's enough of that, Mark. Thank you. We'll go on beyond that now. And so we last time considered who received the letter. Of course, it's written to Hebrew people. And there are some things about the book that are rather odd. The way it starts without an addressing of people. It doesn't mention the author at the beginning, but the old versions start off with, I think a good way of putting it, put the word God right there at the beginning. Yes, sir, Brother Dorian. That's a possibility. Oh, yes. Well, that's not of great consequence at this juncture, but just kind of get your eyes focusing on topics that will come up in this book if you're not able to see all of them. So Melchizedek and Aaronic priesthood, Levitical priesthood, the holiness that the priest had to go through in order to get cleansed, in order to serve, many other things we'll have to note. So as we were studying last time, who was addressed and so forth, trying to figure out those things, whether it was written to Italy, from Italy, whether it was written by this person or that, it gets to be a real bog. The main thing we need to know, written to Hebrew people, the time of the letter is of some consequence, and we have clues in the book as to when it was written. There are places as we get on down through the book that say words that make it sound like the temple was still standing. All right, time to slow down. Who built the temple standing in that era? Herod the Great. Remember what happened? So there was a tabernacle way back in their history. David got things ready. Solomon built that beautiful temple, patterned similarly in its layout to the tabernacle. But anyway, what happened to Solomon's temple? Yeah, destroyed by the Babylonians. By the way, people want to have fancy movies, about what happened to the lost ark and so forth. Well, who came in there and got a hold of all that stuff? I mean, there were lots of valuable things in that temple. And those people who raided that place made off, bandits that they were, with a lot of gold and many other things. Okay, so that was the end of Solomon's temple. People went into captivity. And then in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we read of the Jews doing what? They were in captivity, then what? Yes, some came out of captivity. So was it Cyrus? The people of the later era, after the Babylonians were no longer in power, said, you all return and build. You have permission and go back and build. Of course, there were hecklers over there and they had a hard time. But then the temple was put up again and the people lamented of what a shabby building it was compared to the original. And there are many other things in the Greek era that occurred. But Herod wanted to please the Jews that he dealt with. And so he put a lot of money into building Herod's temple. And you remember whenever Jesus talked about that matter in Matthew 24? And the people were lauding what a beautiful structure it was. And Jesus said, there shall not be one stone left on another. And they were astounded that something as beautiful, well constructed as that was, would go down. So when that one went down, 70 AD, right? That was the end of that. Where's their temple? I mean, this was destruction. And then the Romans were so fed up with the people who had been either captive or driven off or whatever out of Jerusalem, they wouldn't let any of the Jewish people hardly get back into that town for many years. So the writing of this book, it sounds like the temple was still standing, so we take it was before 70 AD, and probably not all that many years prior to that time. Okay, let's look at Hebrews 8, verse 13, and we'll get rolling in this book. Hebrews 8, verse 13. Connecting with what we've just been addressing. I have my newer Bible. I can hardly turn the pages. They're so thin in this Bible. Whenever you get Hebrews 8, verse 13, just go ahead and read out loud, please, if you will. Okay, note carefully Hebrews 8:13. We're jumping ahead, I realize that, regarding the new covenant. But look what he says about the old. That which is becoming old waxes age nigh unto vanishing away. It's obsolete, nigh unto vanishing away. So it sounds like there's still something there, but it's just about shot. That's one clue regarding the time frame for the book. Look at chapter 13, verse 7. Remember them that had the rule over you, men that spake unto you the word of God, and considering the issue of their life, imitate their faith. Now note the way the writer pins that. Is he speaking of present tense? Hebrews 13:7. Remember them that had the rule over you. Okay, presently, but where are they? Who are they thinking about? They're thinking about folks formerly ruling over them. Is that what yours reads? Considering the issue of their life, imitate their faith. So these were people who were believers. So the way he speaks about that kind of looks backward, though he's using the present tense to tell these people to do it. They're apparently believers. Who are the they that have no right? It tells you they who serve the tabernacle. So that is talking about things of the old era. So we versus they contrasted there. That gives a little bit of clue, and then we're moving on through there. For the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burned without the camp. Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered where? Outside, without the gate. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes. People obsessed with meats rather than the grace that was brought through Jesus Christ, it appears there. Okay. 10, 1 and 2. Let's look at that and we'll get off of this. The law having a shadow of good things to come. Chapter 10, verse 1. Not the very image of the things, can never with the same sacrifices year by year, which they offer continually, make perfect them that draw nigh. Else would they not have ceased to be offered, because the worshipers, having been once cleansed, would have no more consciousness of sins. Now, if you scroll through those two verses real carefully, he could be reflecting of old things in the old era. Now, how does yours read there in verse 1 of chapter 10, after it says the same sacrifices year by year? Does yours use a present tense sounding expression, which they offer continually? See, now does that bring to mind something current going on yet? So that's the reason people think, in part, that the temple was still standing and rituals were still going on at the time of the writing. That gets kind of detailed, and we don't want to get bogged down with all the introductory things. But we've gone over quite a lot. There's more. Now, I want to get done with this comment or two that we have about who wrote the book. The bottom line is we don't know. But there are different positions taken. Enumerate a few in your head. Who do you think might have written the book? Your guess is as good as the next one, probably. Usually somebody on the number one will be put up as Paul. Number next. Some people put Barnabas. Who else? Apollos. I'll vote for Apollos. Eloquent man. And you might even think of, people might think of Silas. Somebody might think of Luke. All kinds of speculation. Okay. Well, there are weaknesses and links. Yeah, okay. Not much doctor stuff. All right. But the book does have polished Greek oratory. Oh, yeah, sorry. Felix? Yes, sir. Things that are revealed belong to man. Secret things belong to God. You're about to quote a verse there, Felix. Thank you. So there's a lot of phraseology in this book that gives us some bits of clues as to who wrote it. But this really gets to be a bog. I have bunches of notes, but I don't want to get too worn out with it. The writer does use the Septuagint or Greek translation through the book. Paul would sometimes use the Hebrew rather than Greek in his writings. So that might reflect on who wrote the book. But there is something that is significant. I want to slow down and have you look at this one. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 3. Anybody find Hebrews 2, 3? Read it. I have to these pages where they're working this new Bible. Okay, look at Hebrews 2, verse 3 very carefully. The first part is, of course, the exhortation. But the last part of that verse, having at the first been spoken through the Lord, okay, was confirmed unto us by them that heard. Now, where does the author put himself in that expression? As a hearer. That's the way it comes across in our translations, at least. Does that seem a little bit odd to you for Paul to express it that way? You can look at it two ways. He was not, don't take it, one of the Lord's disciples, of course, obviously when Jesus walked the earth. But did Paul speak of himself receiving the gospel through the testimony of other people? No. Galatians chapter 2, he is adamant. He received revelation by Jesus Christ. He did not receive it from any man. And Paul was preaching for a good period of time in his early ministry before he ever did lay before the Apostle Peter the gospel he was preaching. And then Peter gave him the right hand of fellowship. They were preaching the same gospel. So Paul received his gospel not by testimony of people who had heard Jesus, but he got it directly from the Lord. So this is a bothersome thing to the theory that Paul wrote the letter, but there are ways to argue around all that sort of thing. Yes, that's right. Argue anything to death. All right. And so here's the last expression. I guess we'll talk about that. Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Yes. Yes. He knew Timothy. And so that kind of lends toward Paul, because Paul had Timothy putting around him all over the place. But Timothy was no stranger to many churches, because Paul sent Timothy all over the place to help with churches. Did Paul know Apollos? He sure did. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, right? Okay. To get off of this, an early church figure named Origen wrote, "The writer is known to God alone." So we'll move along. All right. Now, here's something that is very practical. The purpose of the book. There were people in the first century had questions, obviously, about this gospel they'd been hearing. Jesus, whether he was really Messiah, and this faith system that was taught by these apostles. And so those used to Judaism were a little shaken at times about this new system. Now, we'll talk a little about that in detail just as we go along. And that's one of the purposes of the book, to make sure they stay secure in the faith and not go back to the obsolete system. But the writer starts off with the potent way of putting it, God, having of old time spoken in the prophets by diverse portions and manners and so forth, in the last days has spoken to us in Son. Okay, God, Old Testament, same God, New Testament. Now, that's easy to slide by that. We're all used to it. But people at times say, I didn't like that God in the Old Testament. He was mean. You ever hear people talk like that? Thing is, they do not understand God. Okay, I'll take a short tangent here. So the children of Israel are given the promised land. They cross over Jordan, they go in there, and God has a command to get rid of, you get Brother Starling to name off all the ites that lived over the Amalekites, the Hittites, all those others. Roll them off real fast. Get rid of all of them because what was wrong with the people in the land? They were wicked. And God was adamant, don't you make covenants with them. You do not give your sons to their daughters or take the daughters back and forth. You get them out of here. They're all to be destroyed. They're so wicked. If you don't, they'll become thorns in your sides. They'll ruin you. Yes, at times burn up their stuff. And people will say, what about the women and children? Okay, and can I say, I'm not a female, so okay, got that obviously. The women, we feel a little bit more tenderness to them as men, but are women always innocent and pure? No, they're to go down too. And one last thing I will say, what about the children? What children we think of, young ones as innocent, yeah. But if you studied the gross behavior of corrupt, moral people and how they dealt with children, the children at times were ruined. And I won't get into any detail because it's so gross. Okay? We'll leave it at that. And so I do not think God wanted even children who had been permanently wrecked to grow up and continue that vile stuff. Yes, sir. All right. Brother York has a good point. In the human development, I'll call it, of understanding God and his revelation and so forth, he dealt with people in different fashions in the passing of years. And so in the book of Galatians, he'll talk about the old translation. The Old Testament was a schoolmaster, isn't that what it said? To bring us to Christ. Okay, and that's a very interesting word. It had, in Greek, had to do with a slave who took care of the boys, especially in a family as they were growing up. And there are images of them in graphics and so forth of a little bunch of kids going to school with a slave humped over behind them with a whip or whatever, driving them off to school to teach them this thing or two. That was what the old law was like. But now we have been brought to Christ. It's a different era. Very good point there, Brother York. Thank you. Same God, though, in both Testaments. Now, if you put yourself in the mind of these Hebrew people coming into the new era, look around this church building. What elaborate stuff do we have in here? We have ceiling fans, okay? And a roof. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty austere compared to what was in the temple. Okay? And so the rituals and so forth those people went through with all the rigmarole, that was dramatic and caught the eye of people. And so the early church meeting in somebody's courtyard, the house or whatever, that was pretty bare looking compared to what they had over there. So the new covenant is not based on a bunch of physical material objects. Now just think for a moment and help me. In order to practice Christianity, what physical material things do you need? There's a little bit, but not much. People, okay? Brother Bass is holding up the Bible. You want to have the Word. What material things in the worship and so forth? Yes, sir. All right. Yes, Nancy? Lord's Supper. Okay, we do have something physical. We do have the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine. So there we have something, finally. And if you're coming into Christ, what other thing you might point to that's physical? Yes, water. So baptized into Christ, and we have the Lord's Supper. But wow, we have very few material things in Christianity that are necessary to serve God. And that should be telling us, where are the real things? Where is the real Holy of Holies? Where is the real high priest? Yes. So it's a covenant that makes us look up to the real. Yes, sir? Okay, we might extend off of this business of coming into the world with nothing, going out of the world with nothing. We are dependent on God for everything. You get to thinking about it. I didn't wish to be born. That's a dumb way of putting it. But how could I wish before I was born? And whatever I have, if I have a brain, who gave it to me? And so people talk about pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. I know what they're talking about. But if you've got a good brain, well, thank God you got a good brain. If you had good physical skills, good for you. If you have strength to take care of that hard trade that you're involved in, you didn't order that. That was given to you. Everything, the light, the food, the water, we are dependent on God all the way through. And then when you die, are you going to say, well, now I'm going to go and pick out where I'm going to go? Oh, that doesn't work that way, does it? You are completely in the hands up there. Yes, sir. One other thought. Yes. Yeah. Use what you have to glorify God. Okay, now as we're moving forward into the getting the Hebrew mind to look to what is in this new era and why it's superior, which is the purpose of this book, were there things in the old that told people there's something inadequate here? There's got to be more. Did the Old Testament look like it was written to be the ultimate? Or did it indicate there was something else coming? There's something else coming. Of course, they focused on the coming Messiah. Jeremiah 31:31 would talk about a new covenant coming. And they could see in their sacrifices done year by year, well, this is not quite getting us everything's squared away. There's something lacking with these sacrifices, the blood of animals and so forth. So that should have been making them look forward. And by the way, the old law had rules about going for festivals at the city of, where the tabernacle or the Ark of the Covenant was. Well, if you were to travel, all the males were to travel at certain times of the years for those festivals, and you live in the United States, are you going to be able to go to those festivals several times a year over there in the Holy Land? You're going to go broke trying to get there. You know, I'm going to call it a landlocked covenant to a small group of people, not Gentiles. So it's a small matter to have a different purpose than to stay there permanently. There are more things we could talk about there, but let's get on, Mark. I think we have another graphic on, what do I call this? The shadows and types. Is that what this was? Yeah, go ahead if you have that one, please. And we'll be peeking at Bible verses as we go along here into the book of Hebrews. Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God, which is the major thrust of this book. There were inferior shadows and types which God used in former days to lead humans to the real. The types were a kind of prophecy. The types of the Old Testament were a kind of prophecy of things to come. Now, you're familiar with Abraham's offering of Isaac. So there was a figure there. And Melchizedek is brought out, as we've already mentioned in some of these graphics, something to come. And David was told there would be someone who would succeed him. Solomon told the same thing, who would sit on the throne of David. There's something coming. And even when Moses was on the earth, Moses in Deuteronomy 18, is it? Spoke about a prophet like him who would be coming, and you'd better listen to him. Okay, that's a big warning, but someone in the future who is a prophet who had similarities to Moses? In your mind, if you're thinking with me, there are a lot of things between Moses' life and Jesus that can be compared back and forth. Yeah, obviously, lawgivers, both of them. And you even coming out of Egypt, many other things, just goes on and on and on. But I won't get off into that detail. But this book will talk in Hebrews about Moses in chapter 3, verse 3. He has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, speaking of Jesus. He, as much as he that built the house has more honor than the house. Every house is built by someone, but he that built all things is God. Moses indeed was faithful in all things in his house as a servant. Was Jesus in God's house with the title of simply servant? Nope. God in these last days has spoken to us by son. Son is superior to the servant. Okay, well, we can go on and on with that. And then in chapter 4 and so forth of Hebrews through chapter 8, it talks about the high priesthood, the inferior of the old. Okay, the high priest, he's the top guy. In the Old Testament, he got old and he died. How about our high priest? Lives forever to make intercession. And the old tabernacle was obsolete physical features. That's a goner. They were copies of the heavenly one. Now I get to thinking once in a while, and I get to thinking about Moses on the Mount. God gives him instructions about building that tent, that tabernacle affair. And he's warned, see to it that you build all things according to the pattern shown to you on the mountain. Pattern. Be sure you build it according to that pattern. Well, why was it important that he built according to that particular pattern? Yeah, God said it, but why? Yes. Yes. And some year, if we live long enough, maybe I can bring up a sermon between the types in the tabernacle and what it points to in the new. It's really dramatic when you get to thinking about it. That's another topic. So by persuading people to stay in the faith, this writer uses typology. Now, we don't use those words all the time, except if you have an old typewriter, you might use the word type. Sometimes we use the word font anymore, don't we, when we're using computers, different size fonts and all that. But in the writings of these scriptures, we'll have the word type, and then there's something that's on the other side. There's type, and there's what? Antitype. Yes, sir, Steve? Yes. Yes. There are patterns given by God in both those. Yeah, the ark as well. So type is a figure, antitype is the reality which the type prefigured. I want to say that again. So type is the figure, and antitype is the reality which the type prefigured. Now, to me, anti kind of sounds like it ought to be on the other end, but anyway, this seems to be the way it's put in the writings of these scholars. This technique of persuasion by use of parallels between persons or events in the two eras convinces not only believers to stay in the faith, but if an unbeliever read the book of Hebrews and the unbeliever was a Jew, he has a lot to answer because this is a powerful testimony. So, an astounding case it can be made where that rough draft, the type of the old, prefigures the new, that lends weight to the argument that God himself was directing all human history when it comes to revelation, and systems of the old. God was deliberately directing all those types. So when we get over here, we look back and we say, aha, I can see why he did that. Whereas the people in the time, wow, why all this detail on the matter of the sacrifices? I don't get it. Why does the lamb have to not have his bone broken whenever you eat that lamb for the Passover feast? Yes. And so you're referring to what? The Dores, the bones of the lamb were not broken in the old. Who's the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world? Jesus. So he's on the cross. They want to hasten the death of these people on the cross. Break their legs. Okay, you're on a cross. What happens if you break your legs? How can you push up to get air? Yeah. And they came to Jesus and they found what? He was already dead. But to ensure that he was good and dead, I don't know if that's proper English, but make sure he was good and dead, what did the soldier do? Yeah, took that spear and rammed it up through his side, yanked it out, and what came out? Blood and water came out. Okay. So he wasn't up there playing dead. And there are people who take that view. They take the view that he passed out, something like that. Passed out? Yeah. He was dead, and they knew it. They made sure, stabbed him good. Blood and water came out. Okay, if you're faking it and you're stabbed with a spear through your side and blood starts pouring out, what's going to happen to you? You're going to be dead. You'll bleed out. Okay. And then he's in the tomb for the 3 days. So I'm going to get off on a tangent there about the resurrection. Okay. Yes, sir. Yes, that'll be in the book of Hebrews as well. Yes, the perseverance of Jesus. Okay, now I have not gone through this, but we are about out of time. I've got the warning. The English words in the American Standard that I'm currently using up here, found in this book, designating typology, are these words that you'll find. There's likeness and shadow and figure, copy, pattern, example. And some of these are actually translated from one Greek word. They're not all that way, but some are from the same Greek word. Shadow. I like that word shadow because we have a lot of sun down here in Texas. Okay, you know what your shadow looks like at different times of the day when you're out walking in the open and the sun is shining. Okay, you can make out something about your figure according to your shadow. Something about your image, but it's not detailed at all, is it? And so there are things like that in the Old Testament, a of things to come. Number next, let's see in my notes up here, a copy means a specimen or a sketch plan, rather like an architect's blueprint compared to the actual building structure. So that is the idea of copy. Might run off copies of a blueprint. Pattern, well, we know something about pattern. Well, maybe we don't. Any of you ladies use patterns to make dresses anymore? That's about a goner. Very. Ooh. My mother used to make my sister's dresses, I think, when she was small. I still remember those packets with patterns in them. Okay, we know what that is. But pattern means corresponding to a copy, antitype, a representation as the mark left by a mint stroke or a blow, forming a figure such as a pattern seen on coins. Well, if you have coins, you know good and well what they look like, the image on them from the mint. So there's the pattern, likeness. I think King James used the word similitude. That's probably enough of that. Looks like they're opening the door. But we want to take note when we go back and forth between the Old and New Testament that we use what is legitimately a pattern and not jump to conclusions that every single thing in every detail was a pattern. Because we can get ourselves out in deep water if we do that. Some things are obvious, some things are not. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate you being here.